By 8 in the morning in 1940, somewhere in rural Ohio, the yellow school bus rolled into the yard on time. Engine idling, doors folded open. Inside, 7 children sat rigid in their seats, staring forward, not crying, not speaking. The driver lay unconscious on the floor between the pedals, breathing shallow. The schoolteacher was gone. Her coat was still there, draped across the front seat behind the wheel. Heavy gray wool, dusted white with chalk from the day before. When the first man touched it, pulling open the door to check on the children, he jerked his hand back. The coat was warm. Not room warm, body warm, like she had just taken it off and set it down. But the bus was cold. Frost rimmed the inside of every window in thin white lines. The children's breath came out in clouds. The floor was ice to the touch. The lane outside showed tire tracks clear in the packed snow. 2 lines pressed neat from the county road to the schoolyard gate. Bootprints, small and crooked, led from the bus to the schoolhouse door where the children had climbed down one by one after someone finally came to check. But there were no adult prints. Not between the road and the bus, not leading away across the field, not circling the vehicle, not anywhere. The schoolhouse sat at the end of a dirt lane that split off from the main county road, half a mile past the last farmhouse. 1 room, wood frame, white paint peeling near the foundation, a hand pump in the yard, a privy behind a stand of leafless maples. The building had served 3 generations of farm children in that corner of the county, children who walked through snow in winter and dust in summer to learn their letters and numbers from whichever teacher the county could afford to keep. In February, the fields around it stretched flat and white, broken only by rows of cut corn stubble poking through the snow like black stitches. In winter, fog came in low across those fields before sunrise and didn't lift until mid-morning, sitting heavy and damp, the kind that made sound carry strange and swallowed the horizon whole. The children who attended, farm kids, scattered across 5 miles of corn and pasture, knew that road by heart. So did their teacher. Her name was Catherine Marsh, 31 years old, lived alone in a rented room above the dry goods store in the nearest town, 4 miles south, taught at that schoolhouse for 6 years, rode the same bus route every weekday morning, collecting children from their farms and arriving before 8 to light the stove and write the day's lessons on the board in careful, slanted script. She kept a tin of tea in her desk drawer and a wool shawl folded on the back of her chair. She marked papers by lamplight in her rented room at night and walked to the post office every Saturday to mail letters to her sister in Pennsylvania. She was the kind of woman people trusted with their children without question. Steady, soft-spoken, never raised her voice even when the boys got rowdy before recess. The kind who remembered birthdays and brought apples in her bag when a family was struggling. The kind who stayed late to help a slow reader and arrived early to sweep the schoolhouse floor herself, rather than ask a child to do it. The kind who kept attendance in a leather-bound ledger with the date and time written in ink at the top of each page. Never missed, never smudged. That morning the ledger lay open on her desk inside the schoolhouse. The date, February 14th, 1940, was written at the top in her handwriting. Beneath it, her name, Catherine Marsh. Beside it, the time, 8:03 a.m. But Catherine Marsh never made it inside the schoolhouse that morning. The children said so. The driver, when he woke 2 hours later in the county clinic with no memory of how he got there, said so. And the coat on the seat, still faintly warm when they finally moved it to check underneath, said so. The bus had left town just after 6:30, as it did every morning. Catherine sat in the front seat as she always did, her coat folded beside her because the heater worked, and the air inside was stuffy. The driver, a man named Bill Hackett, 62, drove mail routes for 30 years before taking the school run, remembered her saying good morning when she climbed aboard at the corner near the dry goods store. He remembered her adjusting the collar of her dress and smoothing her skirt before sitting down, the way she always did. He remembered stopping at the first farm to pick up the Garrison boys, then the Kohler girls, then 3 more children from houses spaced a mile apart along the county road. He remembered each stop because he'd made the same stops 5 days a week for 2 years. He remembered turning onto the schoolhouse lane just before 8. He remembered the fog sitting low and thick across the field to the east, rolling slow like something breathing. He remembered thinking it was heavier than usual, the kind that made the road ahead disappear past 10 feet. He did not remember what happened after that. When Bill Hackett woke in the clinic, he had a welt across the back of his skull the size of a plum, and no memory of the last hour. The doctor said it looked like he'd been struck, but there was no weapon, no sign of struggle, no bruising on his hands or arms, just the welt, clean and round, like he'd been hit once from behind, and dropped. Bill kept asking where Miss Marsh was, kept asking if the children were safe, kept saying he should have stopped the bus, should have checked on her, but he couldn't say why, couldn't say what made him think something was wrong in the first place. The children, when questioned gently by the county sheriff and later by their own parents in low voices around kitchen tables, said the same thing in different words. Miss Marsh was there, and then she wasn't. One of the older boys, Thomas Garrison, age 10, said she stood up when the bus slowed near the schoolyard. He said she looked out the front window for a long moment, like she saw something in the fog that caught her attention. Then she turned and stepped toward the door, not fast, not panicked, just steady like she meant to check on something. He said Mr. Hackett said something. He couldn't hear what, just a low word or two. And then there was a sound like wood knocking on metal, sharp and quick, and Mr. Hackett fell forward and the bus kept rolling on its own, slow, until it bumped the fence post near the gate and stopped. When Thomas looked up again, Miss Marsh was gone. The door was still closed. The coat was on the seat. The fog pressed against the windows, thick and gray and still, like it was watching them. Another child, Mary Kohler, age 7, said she heard Miss Marsh's voice outside the bus calling soft like she was talking to someone. Mary said it sounded like Miss Marsh was answering a question, but she couldn't make out the words, and when she tried to look through the window, all she saw was fog. She said the voice moved, like Miss Marsh was walking while she spoke, but there was no crunch of boots on snow, no sound of steps at all, just the voice, fading. By the time the first farmer arrived, a man named Dutch Werner, drawn by the sight of the bus sitting crooked against the gate, engine running, exhaust puffing white into the cold air, no adult standing near it. The children were climbing down on their own, walking in a single file line toward the schoolhouse like they'd been told to do. Dutch ran to the bus, saw Bill Hackett on the floor, saw the empty front seat, saw the coat. He touched it without thinking, reaching to move it aside, pulled his hand back fast, looked at the field, looked at the snow, looked at the fog sitting low and motionless over the eastern pasture. No tracks. He called out her name, called it twice. The fog swallowed the sound and gave nothing back. Men in Ohio still won't talk much about that morning, but the older ones remember it. Some of them were part of the search that started an hour later, when the sheriff arrived with 10 men from the surrounding farms, and they began walking the field in a line, shoulder to shoulder, boots crunching through frozen corn stubble, calling her name into the fog. They found nothing that first day. Not a scarf, not a shoe, not a handprint in the snow, not a single depression in the white crust that didn't belong to a man searching or a child walking to the schoolhouse door, but they kept finding the coat. Not the real one, that stayed in the sheriff's office, folded careful in a paper bag, still faintly marked with chalk dust on the shoulders. But in the stories that spread fast through the county, from farm to farm, from the general store to the church steps to the grain elevator where men gathered to smoke and talk, the coat became the thing people couldn't stop mentioning. How it was warm when it shouldn't be, how it sat there like she'd just set it down to step outside for a moment, how the chalk on the shoulders looked fresh, like she'd been writing on the board that very morning. Except she hadn't. How the wool still smelled faintly of lavender soap, the kind she kept in her rented room, the kind her landlady said she ordered from a catalog twice a year. Old hands in rural Ohio, the ones who worked that search or heard about it from their fathers, still tell the younger ones, if you're ever on a bus alone in the fog and you see a coat on the seat that doesn't belong to anyone aboard, you don't touch it. You don't ask whose it is. You keep your eyes forward and you wait for the fog to lift. The sheriff began piecing together the hours before Catherine Marsh vanished by walking backward through Tuesday evening, asking questions in every farmhouse along the route, in the dry goods store where she rented her room, in the diner where she sometimes took supper on Mondays when the store closed early. Everyone remembered seeing her. No one remembered anything wrong. Monday evening, just after 6, the woman who ran the dry goods store, Mrs. Talbot widow, sharp-eyed and particular about her tenants, said Catherine came upstairs with a pot of tea and a book under her arm. Mrs. Talbot heard her moving around in the room above the shop until about 9, then nothing. Catherine was always quiet, always considerate, always up by 5:30 to wash and dress before the bus came through at 6:30. Tuesday morning, Mrs. Talbot said she heard Catherine's door open at 20 past 6, heard her footsteps on the stairs light and quick, saw her through the shop window, walking toward the corner where the bus made its first stop. Gray coat buttoned to the collar, handbag over one arm, same as always. Bill Hackett, the driver, confirmed it. She was waiting at the corner when he pulled up, climbed aboard, said good morning, sat in the front seat, folded her coat beside her because the heater was running and the air inside was warm. He remembered that clearly. Remembered thinking the fog was heavier than usual, but it was February, and fog in February was normal in that part of Ohio. The Garrison boys, Thomas and his younger brother James, were picked up at 6:50. They lived on a farm 2 miles out, past the turnoff to the old Crenshaw place. Their mother stood on the porch and watched them climb aboard, same as every morning. She told the sheriff she saw Miss Marsh sitting in the front seat, saw her smile and nod when the boys said good morning, saw the bus pull away and disappear into the fog down the county road. The Kohler girls, Mary and her older sister Ruth, were picked up at 7:05. Their father walked them to the end of the drive and waited until the bus came. He said Miss Marsh looked tired that morning, but not sick, not upset, just tired, the way teachers get in the middle of winter when the days are short and the schoolhouse is cold. 3 more children were picked up between 7:15 and 7:40, scattered along the same stretch of road. All of them said the same thing later. Miss Marsh was quiet, but she was always quiet in the mornings. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, looking out the window. She didn't read. She didn't speak unless spoken to. She just watched the fields roll past, white and flat under the fog. At 7:50, Bill Hackett turned onto the schoolhouse lane. The fog was thick by then, sitting low enough that he couldn't see the schoolhouse until he was halfway down the lane. He slowed the bus like he always did on foggy mornings and rolled toward the gate. That was the last thing he remembered clearly. The children said Miss Marsh stood up when the bus slowed. Thomas Garrison said she looked out the front window, tilted her head like she was listening, then stepped toward the door. Bill Hackett said something, low, just a word or two, and then there was the sound, sharp and quick, like wood knocking metal, and Bill fell forward. Mary Kohler said she heard Miss Marsh's voice outside, soft and calm, like she was answering someone. Ruth Kohler said she heard it too, but she couldn't make out the words. James Garrison said he didn't hear a voice, but he heard footsteps, slow, crunching on snow, moving away from the bus toward the field. But when the men searched that field an hour later, there were no footsteps, not going toward the field, not coming back, not anywhere. The search began just after 9 when the sheriff arrived with 10 men and 2 dogs. They started at the bus and worked outward in a line, shoulder to shoulder, boots breaking through the frozen crust of snow, eyes scanning every inch of ground. The dogs, both hounds, both steady workers used to tracking game through rough country, pulled hard at first, noses down, tails high. They circled the bus twice, sniffing the tires, the door, the ground beneath the driver's seat. Then they stopped, both of them at the same time about 20 feet from the bus near the edge of the lane where the field began. They sat down in the snow, ears flat, and refused to move. The handler pulled the leashes, called them by name, tugged hard enough that the leather cut into his palm. The dogs whined low and continuous and pressed their bellies to the ground. "They won't go," the handler said, looking at the sheriff. "Never seen them do this." The men kept walking. They covered the field in a grid, marking their progress with strips of torn cloth tied to fence posts so they wouldn't search the same ground twice. By noon, they'd walked every inch of the pasture east of the schoolhouse and found nothing. No cloth, no shoe, no mark in the snow that didn't belong to the search itself. But one of the men, a farmer named Carl Dietrich, 54, worked that land his whole life, said something felt wrong about the field. He couldn't explain it, just said the air felt heavier the farther east they walked, like the fog was pressing on his chest. Another man, younger, said the same thing. Said he felt watched, even though they were alone in an open field in daylight. By mid-afternoon, they'd moved the search to the road itself, checking ditches, checking the tree line, checking the shallow creek that ran along the county road a quarter-mile south of the schoolhouse. They dragged hooks through the water, slow and methodical, even though the creek was barely 3 feet deep and the ice along the edges was thin enough to see through. They found nothing. Then, just before sunset, one of the men went back to check the fence posts where they'd tied the cloth strips. He counted them as he walked the line, making sure none had blown off in the wind. He stopped at the 4th post. There were 2 strips tied there, one white, one blue. He'd tied the white one himself that morning, knotted it tight around the post at chest height. But the blue one was new. He hadn't tied it. He asked the other men. None of them had tied it either. The blue strip was knotted in the same way, at the same height, on the same post. The fabric was clean, dry. The knot was tight, like it had been there for hours. "Somebody's playing games," one of the men said, but nobody laughed. They pulled the blue strip off and brought it to the sheriff. He looked at it, felt the fabric between his fingers, and said nothing. That night, the men who'd searched the field went home and told their wives not to let the children play near the schoolhouse lane. Some of them said it outright. There was something wrong with that field, something that made the dogs stop and the air feel heavy and strips of cloth appear where they shouldn't. The older men in Ohio, the ones who'd worked searches before, the ones who'd pulled bodies from rivers and found lost children in the woods, began telling the younger men, "You don't search alone, not in that field, not near that lane. 2 men, always, never one." On Wednesday morning, the search started again at dawn. This time they brought more men, nearly 30, and spread out wider, covering the farms to the north and south, checking barns and sheds and root cellars. They checked the schoolhouse again, every corner, every floorboard. They checked the privy. They checked the pump. They checked the crawl space under the building, though it was too shallow for a person to fit. They found nothing. But Wednesday afternoon, just after 2, a boy from one of the southern farms came running to the search line, out of breath, saying he'd seen something near the fence line on the far side of the Dietrich property. The men followed him back, moving fast, boots pounding the frozen ground. The boy pointed. There, on the top rail of a wooden fence, sat a pair of gloves. Women's gloves, gray wool, folded neat, one on top of the other. Carl Dietrich stepped forward and picked them up. Still warm. He dropped them, fast, like they'd burned his hands. Looked at the other men, looked at the boy. "Whose are these?" he said, but his voice was too loud, too sharp. Nobody answered. One of the men bent down and touched them, careful, with just his fingertips. He pulled his hand back and nodded. "Warm," he said. They checked the ground around the fence. No footprints, no tracks. No sign that anyone had walked there since the snow fell 3 days before. The gloves were brought to the sheriff. He laid them out on his desk beside the coat, still folded in its paper bag. He called Mrs. Talbot, the landlady, and asked her to come down and look. She looked. She touched them. She nodded. "Those are Catherine's," she said. "I mended the left one myself last November. See the stitching on the thumb?" The sheriff asked her when she'd last seen Catherine wearing them. "Monday evening," Mrs. Talbot said. She had them in her handbag when she came upstairs. But Catherine's handbag had been found on the bus, tucked under the front seat. The gloves weren't inside. The men searched the Dietrich fence line again, walking slow, checking every post, every rail, every inch of ground. They found nothing else. But 2 of them said later they'd heard something while they were out there. A low sound, rhythmic, like someone tapping wood on wood. It came from the direction of the schoolhouse, faint and far off, and when they walked toward it, it stopped. By Thursday, the search had grown to 50 men. The county sent 2 more dogs. The state police sent an officer to take statements and review the physical evidence. But there was no evidence, just a warm coat, a pair of warm gloves, a missing woman, and a field that nobody wanted to walk through alone. On Thursday night, the men who'd been searching for 3 days sat in the back room of the general store, drinking coffee and smoking, talking low. One of them, a man who'd lived in that county his whole life, whose father had worked the same land and whose grandfather was buried in the churchyard on the hill, said it plain. "That field doesn't give back what it takes," he said. "Never has." Nobody argued. Nobody asked what he meant. They just nodded, slow, and finished their coffee in silence. People in Ohio still don't search that field after dark. Not then. Not now. By Friday morning, the search had stopped being a search and started being something else. A vigil. A ritual. Men who had crops to tend and cattle to feed kept coming back to the schoolhouse lane, walking the same ground they'd walked the day before, eyes down, boots heavy. Women brought coffee in thermoses and sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, standing in small groups near the gate, speaking low, watching the field like it might give an answer if they stared long enough. The sheriff organized the men into a grid pattern, marking each section with numbered stakes driven into the frozen ground. They worked in pairs, never alone, walking shoulder to shoulder, checking every inch of earth between the stakes. They covered ground they'd already covered. They checked fence lines they'd already checked. They dragged hooks through the shallow creek again, even though the water was so clear you could see the stones on the bottom. They found nothing, but things kept appearing. Saturday morning, one of the men checking the western fence line found a handkerchief folded neat on a fence post, white linen with a small embroidered C in one corner. He recognized it. Catherine Marsh carried one just like it. He'd seen her use it once, months before, when she'd had a cold and stood outside the schoolhouse during recess, dabbing at her nose while the children played. He called the others over. They gathered around the post, staring at the handkerchief like it was something dangerous. One of them touched it, careful with just 2 fingers. "Warm," he said. Carl Dietrich, who'd found the gloves 2 days before, shook his head and walked away. Didn't say a word. Just walked back toward the schoolhouse and stood with his back to the field, smoking a cigarette down to nothing. The handkerchief was brought to the sheriff. He laid it on his desk beside the coat and the gloves, all 3 arranged in a row like evidence in a trial. But there was no trial, no suspect, no crime anyone could name. Sunday, the search paused for the church service. The pews were fuller than they'd been in years. The pastor, a man named Reverend Mills, older, gray-haired, steady voice, spoke about faith and patience and trusting that God's plan was beyond human understanding. But when he finished and the congregation stood to sing, his hands shook on the hymnal, and his voice cracked on the second verse. After the service, a group of women went to Catherine's rented room above the dry goods store. Mrs. Talbot let them in, standing in the doorway while they looked through her things, not searching, just looking, like they needed to see proof that she'd been real, that she'd lived there, that she'd had a life. They found her dresses hanging neat in the wardrobe, her shoes lined up beneath, her hairbrush on the dresser with a few strands of dark hair still caught in the bristles. They found letters from her sister in Pennsylvania, tied with string, stacked in the top drawer of the small writing desk by the window. And they found her attendance ledger. It was sitting on the desk, open, as if she'd been working on it the night before. But Mrs. Talbot swore Catherine had taken the ledger with her Tuesday morning, swore she'd seen her carrying it under her arm when she left for the bus. The women looked at each other uncertain, and one of them carried the ledger downstairs to show the sheriff. He opened it to the last entry. February 14th, 1940. The date was written at the top of the page in Catherine's handwriting, neat, slanted, careful. Below it, the names of the 7 children who'd been on the bus that morning, each one marked present with a small check beside it. And at the bottom of the column, her own name, Catherine Marsh. Beside it, the time, 8:03 a.m. The sheriff stared at it for a long time. Then he called Mrs. Talbot over and asked her, quiet, when she'd last been in Catherine's room. "Wednesday morning," Mrs. Talbot said. "I went up to check the window latch. The ledger wasn't there then, I'm sure of it." The sheriff asked the women who'd gone up that afternoon. They all said the same thing. The ledger was open on the desk when they walked in, like it had been waiting for them to find it. One of the women, a schoolteacher herself from the next county over, who'd come to help organize meals for the searchers, leaned over the sheriff's shoulder and looked at the handwriting. She knew Catherine's hand. She'd exchanged letters with her twice a year since they'd met at a teaching conference in Columbus. "That's her writing," she said. Her voice was flat. Too flat. "That's Catherine." The sheriff closed the ledger and set it on the desk beside the coat, the gloves, the handkerchief. Nobody touched it after that. By Monday, the theories had started spreading through the county like fever. Nobody said them loud, not in front of the sheriff or the state police officer, but they said them in kitchens and barns and back rooms, voices low, eyes down. Some said Catherine had run off. Said maybe she'd had a man nobody knew about, someone from another town, and she'd planned it all careful and left on purpose. But that didn't explain the coat, still warm, didn't explain the ledger entry, signed after she was already gone, didn't explain the gloves and the handkerchief, appearing warm on fence posts days after she vanished. Others said she'd had enemies. Said maybe someone in the county had a grudge, something old and buried, and they'd taken her while the bus rolled slow through the fog. But that didn't explain the lack of tracks, didn't explain how someone could have pulled her off a moving bus, knocked the driver unconscious, and left no sign, no scuff in the snow, no thread of fabric caught on a nail. Nothing. A few whispered it wasn't a man at all that took her. Whispered the field past the schoolhouse had always been strange, that animals avoided it, that crops planted there grew thin and pale no matter how good the soil tested. Whispered that old Earl Dietrich, Carl's grandfather, had lost a horse in that field back in 1887, found it 3 days later lying dead in the center with no mark on it, no sign of sickness, just dead. Whispered that the fog in that part of Ohio didn't move like normal fog, that it sat too still, that it watched. But nobody said that last part out loud where others could hear, not in daylight, not where it could be repeated. On Tuesday, 1 week after Catherine disappeared, the men held a meeting in the back room of the general store. 30 of them, crowded in, sitting on crates and leaning against the walls. The sheriff stood at the front and laid out what they knew. Catherine Marsh had vanished from a moving bus in broad daylight with 7 children and a driver aboard. She'd left behind her coat, warm. Her gloves and handkerchief had appeared days later, also warm, on fence posts with no tracks around them. Her ledger had turned up in her locked room with an entry dated and timed after her disappearance, written in her own hand. "We've searched every inch of ground for a mile in all directions," the sheriff said. "We've checked every building, every vehicle, every cellar and barn. We've dragged the creek. We've walked the fields. We've brought in dogs and men from 3 counties, and we've found nothing." One of the older men, a farmer named Eli Stokes, 71, born and raised in that county, whose family had worked that land since before Ohio was a state, cleared his throat and spoke. "Maybe we're looking in the wrong place," he said. The room went quiet. "Where should we look?" the sheriff asked. Eli didn't answer right away. He looked at the floor, at the wall, anywhere but at the other men. "My grandfather used to say," Eli said slow, "that there are places in this world that don't follow the rules we know. Places where the land takes what it wants and doesn't ask permission. He said you don't search those places. You stay away from them. You teach your children to stay away, and you don't ask questions about what gets taken." Nobody argued. Nobody laughed. A few of the younger men shifted on their feet, uncomfortable, but nobody spoke. The sheriff closed his notebook and looked at the men. "We keep searching," he said. "But nobody goes out alone, not anymore. 2 men always. And nobody goes near that field after dark." It wasn't an official rule, wasn't written down anywhere, but every man in that room heard it, and every man in that room followed it. After that week, people in Ohio stopped walking the schoolhouse lane unless they had to. Parents started driving their children to school instead of letting them ride the bus, even though gas was expensive and the roads were rough. The county reassigned the bus route, skipping the schoolhouse entirely, sending the children to a larger school 3 miles south. The schoolhouse stayed open through the end of the term, but by autumn it was closed for good. The windows boarded, the door chained. Nobody wanted to teach there. Nobody wanted to send their children there. The coat stayed in the sheriff's office for 2 months, folded in its paper bag on a shelf behind his desk. Then, one morning in April, it was gone. The bag was still there, still folded, but the coat wasn't inside. The sheriff searched the office, searched the building, asked every deputy, every clerk, everyone who had access. Nobody had taken it. Nobody had touched it. 3 days later, a boy walking home from the southern farms said he saw something gray hanging on the fence near the old schoolhouse lane. His father went to check, walking fast, jaw tight. He came back 20 minutes later, pale, and told his son never to go near that fence again. The coat was hanging there, draped across the top rail, neat and smooth like someone had just set it down. The father touched it just once, just to be sure, and pulled his hand back fast. Still warm. He left it there. Didn't tell the sheriff. Didn't tell anyone except his wife. And he told her in a whisper, late at night, with the bedroom door closed. By summer, the fence post where the coat had been found was taken down and burned. The man who burned it said the wood cracked and popped like green timber, even though it was old and dry and should have burned clean. People in Ohio still don't ride alone on foggy mornings. Still don't let their children stand too close to the road when the fog sits low and heavy. Still tell the young ones, when they ask about the old schoolhouse lane, you don't go there. You don't ask why. You just don't go. The schoolhouse stood empty through the summer of 1940. Windows boarded, door chained, grass growing tall around the foundation. By autumn, the county had sold the building to a farmer who tore it down for lumber, pulling the boards free one by one and hauling them away in a wagon. He used the wood to build a chicken coop on his property, 3 miles south, far from the lane where the schoolhouse had stood. The coop burned down that winter. No reason anyone could find. No lightning. No lantern left burning. Just fire, fast and hot, in the middle of a January night when the temperature was well below freezing. The chickens scattered into the snow and survived. The coop burned to the ground and the farmer rebuilt it in the spring using new lumber. He never went back to salvage what was left of the old boards, left them where they lay, charred and broken, and told his sons not to touch them. The lane where the schoolhouse had been was abandoned. The county stopped maintaining it. Grass grew over the tire ruts. Saplings sprouted in the ditches. By 1945, you couldn't tell there'd ever been a road there unless you knew where to look. But people still knew. Parents in that part of Ohio still told their children not to walk near the old lane, even in daylight. Still told them not to answer if they heard someone calling their name from the direction of the field. Still said quiet and firm that some places in the world are better left alone, and you don't need a reason beyond that. The children who'd been on the bus that morning grew up and left the county, most of them. Thomas Garrison joined the Army in 1943 and never came back to Ohio. Mary Kohler married a man from Indiana and moved west. The others scattered, finding work in cities, finding lives that didn't include that field, that lane, that memory. But they remembered. In 1952, a reporter from a Cleveland newspaper came down to write a story about unsolved disappearances in rural Ohio. He'd heard about Catherine Marsh, heard the details were strange, thought it might make a good feature. He spent 2 days in the county talking to the sheriff, a different man by then, the old sheriff having retired in 1948, and visiting the site where the schoolhouse had been. He walked the field, took photographs, interviewed 3 of the men who'd been part of the search. None of them would go on record. The reporter pressed, asked questions, took notes, but every man he spoke to said the same thing in different words. It's better not to talk about it, better not to dig it up, better to let it stay buried. The reporter left without a story. The article was never published. In 1960, the state put in a new highway that ran 2 miles east of the old schoolhouse lane. The construction crew, men from outside the county, brought in to lay asphalt and grade the shoulders, set up a camp near the Dietrich farm, and worked through the spring and summer. One of the crew, a young man from Akron, asked Carl Dietrich if he could walk his dog in the field past the lane in the evenings after work. Carl said no. The man laughed, thought Carl was joking, walked his dog there anyway. The dog came back alone an hour later, shaking, whining, fur slick with something that looked like dew but smelled wrong, metallic, sharp, like burnt iron. The man didn't come back until the next morning, walking slow down the county road, pale, eyes unfocused. He wouldn't say where he'd been, wouldn't say what he'd seen. He quit the crew that afternoon and left the county, didn't collect his pay, just left. Carl Dietrich died in 1964. His son took over the farm and sold the eastern pasture, the one past the old lane, to a developer from Columbus who wanted to build houses. The developer surveyed the land, drew up plans, brought in equipment. The first time the bulldozer rolled onto the field, the engine died. They tried 3 more times, same result. Engine died every time, right at the edge of the field, like something invisible was cutting the power. The developer sold the land back to the Dietrich family at a loss and left. No houses were ever built there. By 1970, most of the people who'd known Catherine Marsh were gone, dead or moved away or too old to remember clearly. But the story stayed. Families in Ohio still told it, not as news, not as history, but as warning. Told it to children who asked why they couldn't play near the old lane. Told it to teenagers who joked about walking the field at night on a dare. Told it to newcomers who moved into the county and didn't know the rules yet. The rules were simple. You don't go near that field alone. You don't go near it after dark. You don't answer if you hear your name called from that direction. And if you see something gray hanging on a fence post near the lane, you don't touch it. You don't look at it too long. You walk away and you don't go back. In 1983, a woman driving through the county on her way to visit family in Columbus got lost and turned onto the old lane by mistake. She drove slow, looking for a place to turn around, and saw something draped across a fence post near the field. She stopped the car, got out, walked over to see what it was. A coat, gray wool, folded neat. She touched it, curious, and pulled her hand back fast. Later, when she stopped at a gas station in the next town, she told the attendant what she'd seen, described the coat, described the lane. The attendant, an older man who'd lived in the county his whole life, went quiet. Then he said, slow and careful, "You didn't take it with you, did you?" She said no. He nodded, told her not to go back, told her to forget the lane, forget the field, forget the coat. She asked why. He didn't answer, just shook his head and walked away. The woman left the county that afternoon and never came back. But years later, she told the story to her daughter, who told it to a friend, who posted it online in 2004 on a forum for unsolved mysteries. The post got 12 replies before the thread was locked. 3 of the replies were from people who said they'd grown up in that part of Ohio. All 3 said the same thing. The coat is real. The field is real. And you don't go there. In 2011, a researcher from a university in Cleveland tried to access the case files for Catherine Marsh's disappearance. The county clerk said the files had been lost in a flood in 1978, but there was no record of a flood that year. No record of water damage to the courthouse, just a note in the ledger. File removed, no reason given. The researcher pushed, filed requests under the Freedom of Information Act, got nowhere, eventually gave up. In 2018, a group of high school students from a neighboring county drove out to the site as part of a history project about rural Ohio. They parked on the county road and walked down the old lane with cameras and notebooks, planning to document what was left of the schoolhouse foundation. They didn't make it past the fence line. All 4 of them said later they'd felt something wrong the moment they stepped onto the lane. One girl said the air felt heavy, like it was pressing on her chest. A boy said he heard a voice, a soft, female, calling his name, coming from the direction of the field. Another girl said she saw something gray hanging on a fence post, folded neat, but when she blinked it was gone. They turned around and left. Didn't take any photos, didn't write the report, changed their project topic to something safer. People in Ohio still don't talk much about Catherine Marsh, but the memory lingers. Not as a mystery to be solved, not as a case to be reopened, but as a scar, a rule, a line nobody crosses. The lane is still there, overgrown, barely visible from the road. The field beyond it is empty. No crops, no cattle, no reason for anyone to go there. The fence posts are rotting, leaning, some of them fallen. But every few years, someone passing by says they see something gray hanging on one of the posts, neat and folded like it's waiting. Nobody stops to check. Nobody wants to know if it's warm. There are 3 versions of what happened to Catherine Marsh that morning in 1940. The first version is human. Someone took her. Someone with a grudge or a plan or a sickness in their mind. Someone who knew the route, knew the timing, knew how to move without leaving tracks. Someone who hid her body so well that 50 men searching for a week couldn't find it. Someone who placed her coat, her gloves, her handkerchief in impossible places just to watch people panic. Someone who broke into her room and forged an entry in her ledger just to make the story stranger. It's the version most people outside Ohio would believe. The version that makes sense in a normal world. The second version is natural. She fell, or ran, or collapsed. The fog was thick. The field was rough. She stepped off the bus, maybe dazed, maybe confused, maybe chasing something she thought she saw, and the ground took her. A sinkhole, a hidden drop, a place the snow covered so well that even 50 men missed it. The warmth of the coat, the gloves, the handkerchief, explainable if you try hard enough. Body heat, sunlight, memory playing tricks. It's the version people tell themselves when they want to sleep at night. The third version is the one nobody in Ohio says out loud, but everyone who's lived there long enough knows. The version that says the field past the old schoolhouse lane doesn't follow the rules, that it takes what it wants, that it leaves signs, warm cloth, backward tracks, voices in the fog, not as clues but as warnings, that Catherine Marsh didn't leave that bus because someone pulled her off. She left because something called her, and whatever called her didn't bring her back. It's the version that explains why the dog stopped, why the cloth strips appeared, why the ledger entry was signed after she was gone, why the coat still turns up, warm, on fence posts where no one goes. It's the version that makes people in Ohio teach their children the rules, the version that keeps the field empty, the version that no one dares to say out loud, because saying it makes it real. Which version makes sense here? The human one, the natural one, or the impossible one nobody in Ohio dares to say out loud? Subscribe so you don't miss the next story.